3 hours of driving, and all I wanted was to return to the vineyard in Sonoma, the only place that still held the scent of oak, the warmth of sunlight, and the memory of my late husband, Frederick. But the moment I stepped through the wooden gate, I froze. My daughter, Catherine, sat comfortably on the porch swing Frederick and I had spent an entire summer building. Next to her was her husband, Robert, and his parents, Jordan and Pilar, each holding a glass of wine as if this were their grand estate. Catherine looked me straight in the eye, her voice calm but merciless. "I'm sorry, Mother, but you're not allowed here anymore. This vineyard belongs to us now." My fingers tightened around the strap of my bag until the veins rose beneath my skin. I smiled, the kind of slow smile people mistake for surrender. But in my mind, a vow had already been made. They would never forget this day. The evening light spilled gold across the grapevines, the same glow Frederick once called a glimpse of heaven. But I knew heaven had just been violated, and hell was about to open its doors. I wasn't born into vineyards or sprawling land in Sonoma. I was born in a small town in Nebraska, the daughter of a school teacher and a factory worker. My parents had nothing but grit and the belief that if you worked hard enough, life would eventually give back. By the time I was 17, I had already learned that belief wasn't always true. My father's job was cut during a round of layoffs, and my mother worked double shifts just to keep food on the table. I left home the day after high school graduation with a single suitcase and $68 in my pocket. College was out of the question then. Instead, I cleaned offices, waited tables, and saved every dime I could. Nights were the worst, lonely and cold in the tiny room I rented, but it was in those nights that I taught myself something no one else could teach me: survival. By my mid-20s, I'd scraped together enough to take night classes in business and real estate law. That was where I met Frederick Barnes, a man who carried the calm of someone who understood land and patience. He wasn't flashy, not the kind of man who lit up a room, but he had the steadiness of an oak tree. He used to say, "Emma, the law is like a vineyard. You can't rush it. You plant, you water, you wait. But if you care for it, one day it cares for you." Together, we started from nothing. Frederick worked construction by day and studied land management by night, while I ground my way through law school, balancing textbooks with overdue bills. We couldn't afford vacations, fancy clothes, or even a car that didn't break down twice a year. What we had instead were long walks, whispered promises, and a shared dream to someday own a place that was ours. That dream took nearly 3 decades. Piece by piece, penny by penny, we built our lives until we could finally purchase the vineyard on the rolling hills of Sonoma. I still remember the day we signed the papers. Frederick's hand trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. "This," he whispered, looking out at the endless rows of vines, "is our heaven." But heaven doesn't last forever. When Frederick was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, everything stopped. The vineyard we had poured ourselves into became a backdrop for his slow decline. I walked those rows alone, tears mixing with dust, as I tried to prepare myself for the inevitable. Every night, when the pain was too much, he'd squeeze my hand and say, "Emma, promise me you'll never let them take this place from you. It's where I'll always be." He died in the spring, when the vines were just beginning to bud. The world looked alive, but mine had gone silent. For months, I wandered like a ghost. The house felt too big, the vineyard too endless. Catherine, my only child, visited now and then, though never for long. She said it was hard to be here without him. Hard for her, maybe, but for me, it was unbearable. Still, I stayed. I took care of the vineyard, even when it felt like the vines mocked me with their resilience. I sanded the old porch swing we'd built, repaired the trellises Frederick had once hammered together, and kept the rows pruned as best I could. People told me to sell, to downsize, to move closer to the city, but they didn't understand. Selling the vineyard would mean selling the last piece of him. Catherine grew more distant after Frederick's death. She married Robert, a man I barely knew, and seemed to drift into his family's orbit. They had their polished dinners, their vacations, their perfect smiles, and I told myself that was fine. She was young. She had her own life to build. But in my loneliest hours, I wondered, had I given her too much? Too much love? Too much sacrifice? Too much of myself? I paid for her education, her wedding, her first home. Every time she asked, I gave. Because that's what mothers do. Or so I thought, until the day I walked into my vineyard and heard my own daughter tell me I was no longer welcome. That the place I bled and fought for, the place Frederick had begged me to protect, now belonged to her and her husband's family. The betrayal didn't just cut. It confirmed something I had long tried to ignore. I had raised a daughter who thought generosity was weakness and that inheritance was entitlement. But she was wrong. She didn't know me. Not really. Not the woman who clawed her way out of a one-room apartment. Not the wife who held a dying man's hand and promised to keep his heaven safe. Not the survivor who had spent a lifetime turning nothing into something. I had been silent too long. That day, standing in the driveway with their laughter echoing behind me, I realized Catherine had drawn a line. But she had no idea what it meant to cross mine. After Frederick's death, people expected me to fade into the background. A widow in her 60s, alone with a vineyard too large to manage, most assumed I would eventually give up, sell the land, and retreat into some small apartment in the city. They underestimated me. The vineyard became my salvation. At first, I stumbled through it, clumsy and broken, pulling weeds with tears streaming down my face. But as weeks turned into months, the rhythm of the vines began to steady me. Sunrise meant irrigation checks. Midday meant pruning and balancing the trellises. Sunset meant walking the rows with a notebook in hand, jotting down everything that needed repair. Routine became medicine. Labor became prayer. I hired a small but loyal team of workers, men and women who respected the land as much as Frederick once did. Together, we revived the vineyard. We experimented with new irrigation systems, invested in better soil treatments, and replanted sections that had withered during the years of Frederick's illness. Slowly, the land responded. The vines grew stronger, the grapes fuller. By the second harvest under my care, the vineyard yielded a vintage that surprised even the most skeptical buyers. That was the turning point. Word spread in Sonoma about the widow who had kept her vineyard alive against the odds. Distributors began to take notice. A wine magazine featured me in a short article. Emma Barnes, turning loss into legacy. Orders grew. Restaurants from San Francisco and Napa added Barnes Vineyard to their lists. For the first time in years, I felt something close to pride, not just for surviving, but for thriving. I had taken the dream Frederick and I once shared and kept it alive. Not out of desperation, but out of strength. Financially, I was no longer struggling. The vineyard brought in enough income not only to cover operations, but to provide a comfortable life. I restored the farmhouse, repaired the old barn, and even built a small tasting room that attracted weekend tourists. On Saturdays, I would walk among visitors, listening quietly as they admired the vines. They saw beauty. I saw endurance. And though I often stood alone on the porch at night, looking out over the fields, I did not feel as broken as before. Frederick was everywhere. The swing he built, the tools he left in the shed, the vines we planted side by side. The vineyard was no longer just a reminder of loss. It had become proof that I could carry on, that his faith in me was not misplaced. Catherine visited occasionally during those years of rebuilding, though she never stayed long. She always seemed distracted, restless, impatient with the quiet work of the vineyard. "It's too much land for one woman," she would say, as though I hadn't already proved otherwise. I brushed her comments aside, too focused on what I was building to see them for what they were: the early signs of a storm. By my 62nd birthday, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades: security. The vineyard was stable, the books balanced, the land thriving. I had achieved what many doubted I could. I wasn't just a grieving widow clinging to memories. I was a landowner, a businesswoman, and above all, a survivor. I thought I had weathered the worst life could throw at me. I thought my battles were behind me. I was wrong. Because true betrayal doesn't come from strangers. It comes from those you've fed, clothed, and loved. It comes from the child you sacrificed everything for. And when Catherine stood on that porch, surrounded by Robert and his family, and told me I no longer belonged in my own home, I realized that all my past struggles had only prepared me for this: the fight to protect not just my land, but my dignity. Betrayal never announces itself with thunder. It creeps in quietly, dressed in familiar faces, speaking with voices you once trusted. When Catherine stood on that porch and told me I wasn't welcome anymore, I thought perhaps she had spoken in a moment of recklessness. A daughter, frustrated, maybe even manipulated by her husband. But the very next day, the truth revealed itself. It was a Thursday morning when my phone buzzed. The name on the screen made my stomach tighten. Catherine. "Mother!" Her voice was clipped, almost rehearsed. "Robert and I have decided it's best if you stop coming to the vineyard altogether. It's time for a transition." "Transition?" I repeated, tasting the bitterness of the word. "Yes, you've done your part. You kept the place running after Dad died, and we're grateful. But now it's our turn. Robert's parents are ready to move in. They'll oversee the vineyard, and we'll modernize operations. You can step back. Step back." That was the phrase she chose, as if decades of sacrifice could be reduced to an old woman moving aside politely. "Catherine," I said, my voice steady though my hand trembled, "this vineyard is not yours to give away." Silence. Then Robert's voice cut in from the background, smooth and commanding. "Emma, with all due respect, you're 62. You can't run a vineyard forever. You'll burn yourself out. Let people who are younger, stronger, more capable take over. Younger, stronger, more capable." The words stung, but not because they were true. They stung because my own daughter had let them be said. "Robert," I replied, "I built this vineyard with Frederick. Every vine in the ground is ours. Every beam in the house was paid for by us. You didn't build it, and neither did your parents." He chuckled softly, the kind of laugh meant to belittle. "Ownership is one thing, Emma. Practicality is another. You barely come out here anymore. Catherine says you spend most of your time in San Francisco. Isn't it selfish to let all this sit unused when a family could truly live here?" I almost dropped the phone. Selfish. That was their argument. After decades of sacrifice, of scraping and clawing my way to stability, I was selfish for not handing over everything to them. "Listen carefully," I said, my voice low and sharp. "The vineyard belongs to me. It always has, and it always will. Don't confuse my silence with weakness." Catherine's voice returned, softer now, but no less cruel. "You've had your time, Mother. It's ours now." The line went dead before I could reply. That evening, I drove back to the vineyard. My name was still on the deed. My blood and sweat were still in the soil. And yet, when I arrived, I felt like a trespasser in my own land. Robert's SUV was parked in the driveway, bags stacked by the porch. Inside, I saw Pilar adjusting the curtains as though she already owned them. Jordan's laugh echoed through the halls. Catherine sat at the kitchen table sipping wine, as if this takeover were nothing more than a family decision. When I walked in, the conversation stopped. "You shouldn't be here," Robert said flatly. "I own this place," I reminded him. "Not for long," Pilar answered, her voice dripping with certainty. "We've spoken to an agent. Papers will be drawn soon. This vineyard will finally have proper caretakers." I stared at Catherine, waiting for her to correct them, to defend me, to remember all the years I carried her on my back, all the nights I stayed awake so she could sleep peacefully. But she looked down at her glass instead, unable to meet my eyes. That was when I understood. She wasn't being manipulated. She was complicit. I turned and left without a word. Driving back down the winding road, the vines stretched out in the rearview mirror like 1,000 accusing fingers. Frederick's voice echoed in my memory. "Promise me you'll never let them take this place from you." I hadn't realized then how literal his warning would become. The days that followed were filled with small humiliations. A neighbor called to tell me they'd seen Robert giving tours of the vineyard as though it were already his. Another friend mentioned that Catherine had updated her social media profile with photos of the vineyard captioned, "Our family's future." And then there was the letter. An envelope slid under my door, unsigned, but unmistakable. It read, "For your own good, step aside. The vineyard doesn't belong to you anymore." I burned the letter in the fireplace, watching the flames curl around the paper. But the words didn't vanish. They carved themselves into my resolve. For weeks, I stayed away. I told myself to wait, to gather my strength. I remembered all the nights Frederick and I sat at the kitchen table, drafting legal documents, reviewing contracts. He had taught me that in every battle, timing was everything. You don't swing when you're off balance. You wait until your feet are planted, until the strike will land with precision. Catherine and Robert believed they had won. They moved into the house, settled into the life Frederick and I had built. They drank our wine, slept in our rooms, walked our land. They thought silence meant surrender, but they didn't know me. I had spent a lifetime fighting uphill battles. I had clawed my way from poverty into stability. I had survived the death of my husband and the loneliness of widowhood. I had carried this vineyard on my shoulders when the world expected me to crumble. I was not about to let my own daughter erase me from my legacy. The betrayers had returned, and they believed the vineyard was theirs. But they had no idea that I was just beginning to sharpen my tools. I didn't storm back to the vineyard. That's what they expected. An emotional outburst, an old widow banging on the door, screaming about betrayal. No. I had learned long ago that when someone believes they've already beaten you, the best weapon you have is patience. The first test began quietly. On a Monday morning, I drove into town, not toward Sonoma, but to the county clerk's office. The woman behind the desk barely looked up as I requested property records for Barnes Vineyard. I knew what I would find. My name, written clean and indisputable. But I needed confirmation, a tangible reminder that no matter what Catherine and Robert told themselves, the law was still on my side. The woman returned with a stack of papers, stamped and official. Emma Barnes, the document read. Owner, sole proprietor. I ran my fingers over the embossed seal and felt a calm certainty spread through me. They could drink my wine and sit in my chairs, but they were squatters in every legal sense, and squatters eventually fall. The second step was observation. I drove out near the vineyard, but didn't pull into the driveway. Instead, I parked half a mile down the road where the hill curved and gave me a clear view of the house. Through binoculars, I watched as Robert strutted around the rows of vines with a clipboard, as though he understood anything about soil pH or pruning cycles. Pilar followed him, snapping photos on her phone. Catherine emerged later, carrying a basket, her hair shining in the sun. She looked radiant, comfortable, as though the land had already shifted its loyalty. It was surreal, watching my own daughter move across the porch of the house Frederick and I had built, as if I were the intruder. But I did not let rage consume me. I took notes instead: times, faces, behaviors. In law, evidence isn't about what you feel. It's about what you can prove. I called an old friend that evening, one I hadn't spoken to in years. His name was Thomas Green, a retired investigator who had once helped Frederick and me settle a boundary dispute with a neighboring farm. He was sharp, discreet, and knew how to uncover what people didn't want revealed. "Emma," he said after listening to my story, "you don't need me to tell you this stinks of entitlement. But if they're planning something, like trying to transfer the property or fake some kind of co-ownership, you'll need more than indignation. You'll need a trail." "What kind of trail?" I asked. "Paper, digital, verbal. I'll start by checking if they've been in contact with real estate agents or banks. You keep an eye on their activities. If they slip, I'll find it." We agreed to meet the following week, but he promised to make calls immediately. I hung up, feeling the first spark of control return. The following day, I tested my daughter. I called Catherine, my voice carefully measured. "I'd like to come by tomorrow," I said, "to check on the vines. I noticed from the road that some of the trellises near the south slope are leaning." A pause. Then her voice, brittle. "Mother, I told you. This isn't your responsibility anymore." "Responsibility?" I repeated softly. I wasn't aware responsibility could be reassigned like a coat you hand to someone else. "Please don't make this harder," she said. "Catherine," I replied, "I'm not making it harder. I'm reminding you that vineyards don't yield to speeches. They yield to care, and no one in that house knows how to care for them." She bristled. "Robert has it under control." I almost laughed. Robert couldn't tell mildew from sunburn on a leaf, but I didn't argue. Instead, I said, "Very well, but remember this: when the vines die from neglect, the land won't blame me." Then I hung up. It was a test, and she failed. She was defensive, panicked even. That told me they were already in over their heads. Good. By Friday, Thomas called back with news. "You were right to be suspicious. Robert contacted a real estate office in Napa, asked about transferring a property deed, and inquired about tax implications for family inheritance. They don't know the property is yours alone. They're moving as if the land already belongs to them." My jaw clenched. "Can they do anything without my signature?" "No," Thomas assured me. "But they can try to fake, pressure, or manipulate. That's why you need to be ready." I spent the next few days building a dossier. Every call from Catherine was recorded. Every text saved. Every suspicious car in the driveway photographed. I made a file thick enough to crush arrogance under its weight. Frederick once told me, "The law is slow, but it is exact." I intended to wield it like a hammer. But I wasn't relying on the law alone. I also tested Robert. I went to the local supplier where we always ordered our irrigation equipment. I asked casually if anyone new had been in recently. The owner leaned forward conspiratorially. "That young man, Your son-in-law came in last week asking about bulk orders of fertilizer, but he didn't know what kind he needed. Wanted to buy whatever was cheapest. I thanked him, but inside, I smiled. Robert was proving his ignorance publicly, leaving a trail of incompetence I could use later. Meanwhile, Pilar began throwing small gatherings at the house. I knew because I drove past late one Saturday and saw the driveway filled with cars, laughter spilling into the night air. She was already showing off my home as though it were hers. But the greatest test came when Catherine herself reached out again. This time, she asked me to meet for coffee in town. I agreed, curious to see if there was a sliver of my daughter left beneath all that entitlement. She arrived in a crisp blouse, her hair neatly tied back. She looked more like a businesswoman than a daughter coming to speak to her mother. "Mother," she began, "this can't go on. You hovering, you spying, you refusing to let go. It's not healthy. Robert and we're trying to build a future here." "A future built on theft?" I asked calmly. Her jaw tightened. "It's not theft, it's legacy. Dad would have wanted the vineyard to stay in the family." "Then he should have left it to you," I said, my tone like ice. "But he didn't. He left it to me. Because he knew the difference between a family that cherishes land and a family that sees it as leverage." She flinched, but quickly masked it. "If you fight us, you'll only embarrass yourself. People will see you as bitter, clinging to something you can't manage. Don't ruin your name, Mother." There it was, the veiled threat. Reputation, shame, public image. They thought I would crumble at the idea of gossip, of whispers in the town. But I had weathered worse storms than whispers. "Catherine," I said, leaning forward, "you may have Robert, and you may have his parents, but you don't have me, and you will never have this vineyard. Not while I still breathe." Her lips pressed together, pale with anger. She stood, collected her purse, and left without a word. I sat there a long while after she was gone. My tea had gone cold, but my resolve had never been hotter. The test was complete. My daughter had chosen her side, and it wasn't mine. But tests are not just about answers, they're about preparation. And I now had everything I needed to move into the next phase. The betrayers thought they had cornered me. What they didn't realize was that I had already begun investigating, building, and waiting. They thought they were playing chess. But they were moving pawns while I was carving the board itself. And soon, very soon, they would learn that when Emma Barnes tests her enemies, she never does so without knowing exactly how she plans to finish the game. Evidence isn't only found in courtrooms, it's everywhere. Hidden in careless words, in paper trails, in the arrogance of people who believe no one is watching. I had spent most of my career as a real estate attorney, reminding clients that documents speak louder than declarations. Now, I turned that skill against my own blood. The first step was my phone. I upgraded to one with extended storage, not because I cared about apps, but because I planned to fill it with recordings. Every call from Catherine, every text, every voicemail, I kept them all. I purchased a secondary line under a different name and used it for conversations with suppliers and contractors. That way, if Robert or his parents tried to manipulate vendors into cutting me off, I would know immediately. The second step was sight. I invested in discrete cameras, battery-powered, motion-activated, and small enough to vanish into the corners of my vineyard house. With the help of Thomas Green, my investigator friend, we installed them on a quiet Wednesday afternoon while Catherine and Robert were away. One above the entryway, another in the kitchen, a third covering the office where Frederick and I had kept decades of records. "You'll get a direct feed," Thomas explained, syncing the devices to my tablet. "If they snoop, forge, or tamper with anything, you'll see it." By Friday night, the cameras gave me my first piece of evidence. Robert was in the office, rifling through drawers. He pulled out Frederick's old ledger books, records of harvest yields, contracts, and purchase receipts. He flipped through them carelessly, tossing pages aside. Then he paused, snapped photos with his phone, and stuffed the ledger into his bag. I watched from my study in San Francisco, rage simmering beneath my skin. He wasn't preserving memories. He was building a case, twisting Frederick's work into his own. I clipped the video, time-stamped it, and saved it into a folder labeled simply, Proof. The third step was paper. I requested certified copies of every property deed, tax record, and mortgage statement linked to the vineyard. I kept them in a locked fireproof box. I also documented all my financial contributions to Catherine's life. Tuition receipts, the down payment on her first condo, the checks I wrote for her wedding. Individually, they were memories of generosity. Together, they painted a picture of a woman who had given endlessly, proof that Catherine's cries of neglect were nothing more than fabrication. Thomas dug deeper. A week later, he called with his findings. Robert's been in contact with 2 banks. He asked about refinancing the vineyard property to take out a loan. Of course, they told him he needed ownership first, but the man is persistent. Desperate, more like, I muttered. Either way, Thomas said, it shows intent. If he's trying to leverage land that doesn't belong to him, that's fraud, and fraud leaves a trail. We agreed to document every inquiry, every meeting. Thomas had friends in the industry who owed him favors. Information flowed easily into my growing file. Meanwhile, Pilar and Jordan provided evidence without even realizing it. At a small dinner in town, a neighbor mentioned overhearing Pilar brag about their vineyard. She had spoken openly, loudly, with the smug certainty of a woman who believed her future was already secured. That neighbor, bless her heart, sent me an email detailing the entire conversation. I printed it, dated it, and slipped it into my file. Words can't be unsaid, especially when they're written down. But the most telling evidence came from Catherine herself. One evening, she called me, her tone sugar-sweet, the kind she used as a teenager when she wanted money for a new dress. "Mother," she began, "we've been thinking, you should consider drafting a will that includes the vineyard. It would give everyone peace of mind, so there's no confusion later." I let her speak. She went on about responsibility, about protecting the family's future. But the subtext was clear. She wanted legal groundwork that would cement her claim. "Catherine," I said, my voice even, "why would I draft a will for something I have no intention of giving up?" Silence. Then, softly, "Because one day you won't have a choice." I ended the call without another word, then saved the recording. That single sentence, cold, calculated, dripping with entitlement, was more damning than anything Thomas could dig up. Over the next 2 weeks, my folder grew into a binder. Inside it, video clips of Robert stealing Frederick's ledgers. Bank inquiry notes Thomas intercepted. A neighbor's statement about Pilar's bragging. Texts from Catherine pressuring me to step aside. Call recordings where she admitted they were planning for my absence. Financial records proving decades of my support. Each piece was a nail. Together, they were a coffin. Still, I wasn't satisfied. Evidence in the shadows was powerful, but I needed them to expose themselves publicly, to reveal their greed in a way that couldn't be ignored. So, I set a trap. I invited Catherine and Robert to lunch at a restaurant in town. Pilar and Jordan insisted on coming too. I arrived early, requested a booth in the corner, and asked the waitress to bring an extra coffee pot. Then I placed my phone on the table, screen down, recording. They arrived in a flurry of confidence. Catherine smiled like she was already the matriarch of the vineyard. Robert spoke about expansion and distribution deals as though he were some seasoned vintner. Pilar leaned forward and whispered, "Emma, this will be easier for you if you simply transfer the deed now." "Avoid the legal mess later," Jordan nodded sagely. "Families should handle these matters privately. No need to involve lawyers." I sipped my coffee, calm as stone, and let them ramble. Every word was captured, every arrogant declaration sealed into digital memory. When Robert leaned in and said, "If you don't hand it over, we'll make it impossible for you to enjoy the place anyway," I nearly smiled. They were building my case for me. By the time the check arrived, I had everything I needed. Walking out of the restaurant, Catherine caught my arm. "Mother, you're being unreasonable. Do you want to lose us over this?" I looked at her, really looked. My daughter, the child I once carried in my arms, was now a stranger. "I already have," I whispered. Then I pulled free. That night, back in my study, I laid the binder on the desk. Page after page, clip after clip, evidence mounted like an army waiting for orders. Frederick's photo watched from the shelf above me, his smile frozen in sunlight. "I promised you," I murmured, touching the glass of the frame. "I promised I'd never let them take this place." The evidence was ready. The vineyard was still mine. And soon, Catherine and Robert would realize the truth that every courtroom knows. It's not the loudest voice that wins. It's the one with the proof. Plans, I had learned, are built like walls, brick by brick, each piece deliberate, each angle calculated. I wasn't going to storm my vineyard with fists and fury. That would make me look like the bitter widow they wanted to paint me as. No, my retaliation would be invisible until it wasn't. Silent until it roared. The first brick was legal. With Thomas's help, I sat down with Marcus Lane, a real estate attorney I trusted. He was sharp, meticulous, and loyal to no one but the law. I slid the binder of evidence across his desk and watched his eyes widen as he flipped through page after page. Robert's theft of Frederick's ledgers, Pilar's bragging, Catherine's manipulative texts. "Emma," he said at last, "this isn't just entitlement. This is attempted fraud, harassment, maybe even coercion. You've got them cornered before the fight even begins." "I don't just want to corner them," I said. "I want to make sure they never try this again." Marcus leaned back. "Then we put up paper walls, stronger than steel. We'll tighten the deed under a living trust. We'll record every threat formally. And if they so much as step out of line again, we'll pursue charges." It was exactly what I needed. Legal fortification. The second brick was psychological. My daughter and her husband believed they had power because they occupied the house. They thought presence meant possession. I intended to flip that illusion on its head. With Thomas, I adjusted the cameras, linking them to an app that allowed me to trigger small, unsettling events remotely. Lights flickering, alarms chirping, irrigation pumps activating at odd hours. Nothing illegal, just enough to remind them the land itself wasn't theirs. "The goal," Thomas said, "isn't to scare them off overnight. It's to wear them down, make them uneasy, break their illusion of control." The third brick was reputation. In a town like Sonoma, reputation was currency. I began hosting small tastings in San Francisco, using bottles from the vineyard's best vintages. Each time, I spoke warmly about Frederick, about our legacy, about keeping the vineyard alive through hardship. I didn't mention Catherine or Robert, but I didn't need to. Word travels faster than truth, and soon the whisper was everywhere. Emma Barnes is the heart of that vineyard. Meanwhile, Pilar and Jordan's arrogance worked in my favor. They boasted too loudly, too soon. One evening, a fellow vineyard owner called me. "Emma, I don't know what's happening, but Pilar was at a luncheon talking about expanding production on land she doesn't even own. People are starting to question her sanity." I thanked him, smiled to myself, and made a note. Let them keep digging their own hole. But the most important brick was timing. I circled a date on the calendar, the end of the harvest season. Catherine and Robert had no idea how brutal harvest could be, how much sweat and precision it demanded. I would let them fail publicly, let their incompetence show, and when the grapes withered from mismanagement, I'd present my evidence to the town, to the courts, to anyone who mattered. They wanted to replace me? Then let them prove they could handle the vineyard. Spoiler, they couldn't. Late at night, I spread papers across my kitchen table. On one side, legal documents Marcus had prepared. Trust transfers, cease and desist drafts, trespass warnings. On the other, notes from Thomas. Times Robert left the vineyard unattended, bank calls he made, suppliers he tried and failed to charm. In the center, my binder of evidence. It felt like a war room, and in a way, it was. Except my weapons weren't guns or knives. They were signatures, recordings, and strategy. I thought of Frederick often during those nights. He had always been a patient man, steady even in conflict. "Measure twice, cut once," he used to tell me. I could almost hear his voice as I arranged my plans. Measure twice, cut once. The final piece of my retaliation was symbolic. I drafted a letter, not for Catherine, but for the Veterans Relief Foundation, a charity Frederick had once admired. The letter outlined my intent to donate a portion of the vineyard's profits to fund housing for veterans. It wasn't binding, not yet, but I kept it ready, a reminder that the vineyard could serve a greater purpose than lining Robert's pockets. By the time the harvest began, my plan was set. Catherine and Robert would stumble under the weight of responsibility they didn't understand. Pilar and Jordan would boast their way into discredit. And when the season ended, I would strike, not with anger, but with precision. For years, I had carried my family, given more than I should have, stayed silent when I should have spoken. That silence was over. The vineyard wasn't just land. It was my husband's legacy, my life's proof, my soul stitched into rows of vines. And if Catherine thought she could erase me from it, she was about to learn the hardest lesson of all. A mother may forgive betrayal, but she never forgets. And she never, ever surrenders. Harvest season exposes truth faster than any courtroom. Grapes don't lie. They either flourish under care or rot under negligence. By October, it was clear to everyone in Sonoma that my vineyard was suffering, not because of me, but because of Catherine and Robert. Word spread quickly. Irrigation mismanaged, workers unpaid, entire rows of vines left unpruned. The once praised Barnes Vineyard was now whispered about as a tragedy in the making. But I had let it happen on purpose. I had waited for this moment. The county hosted its annual Vintners Association meeting in town. Vineyard owners, distributors, journalists, all gathered under the same roof. It was the perfect stage. I arrived early, binder in hand, dressed in a dark suit Frederick once said made me look like a woman no one should underestimate. Robert and Catherine walked in together, flanked by Pilar and Jordan. They looked confident, radiant even, as though their incompetence hadn't already become gossip. Robert shook hands. Catherine smiled. Pilar whispered boasts to anyone who would listen. When the floor opened for discussion, Robert seized it. He spoke about modernizing Barnes Vineyard, about ushering in a new era. His tone was smooth, but the room shifted uneasily. Everyone knew yields had plummeted. Everyone knew he was drowning. I stood slowly. Conversations hushed. All eyes turned to me. "With respect," I began, my voice calm but carrying. "Barnes Vineyard has not entered a new era. It has entered a crisis, and it's because people who do not own it do not understand it, and do not care for it have tried to seize what was never theirs." Robert's smile faltered. Catherine's eyes narrowed. Pilar opened her mouth, but I raised a hand. I pulled a folder from my binder and laid it on the table. "This is the deed. My name is the sole owner. Legally binding. Certified. These," I continued, flipping pages, "are bank inquiries Robert made in Napa, trying to leverage property he doesn't own. These are text messages from Catherine pressuring me to step aside. Here is testimony from neighbors who overheard Pilar boasting about a vineyard she has no claim to." Murmurs rippled across the room. I could see heads shaking, jaws tightening. Reputation, my third brick, was crumbling around them. Robert tried to laugh it off. "Emma, this is a family matter. It doesn't belong in public." "Oh, but it does," I countered, "because this vineyard is more than my family. It is contracts, it is trade, it is reputation, and all of you here have a stake in whether business is done honestly in this valley." I switched on my tablet and played a recording. Catherine's voice filled the room. "Because one day, you won't have a choice." The silence afterward was suffocating. Catherine went pale, Robert clenched his fists, Pilar shifted uncomfortably, Jordan stared at the floor. "Fraud," I said simply. "That is what this is. Attempted fraud, harassment, coercion, and it ends tonight." Marcus, my attorney, stepped forward with official notices, cease and desist orders, trespass warnings, and documentation of the trust we had secured. He laid them out for all to see. "Any further attempt to interfere with Barnes Vineyard will be considered criminal trespass and prosecuted accordingly," he said. The final blow came when I added, "And beginning next season, a portion of vineyard profits will be donated to the Veterans Relief Foundation, an organization Frederick admired. This vineyard will not be stolen. It will serve a greater good." Applause erupted. It wasn't loud or raucous, but steady, respectful, undeniable. My name, my reputation, my vineyard, they were restored in a single moment. Robert and Catherine stood frozen, their grand narrative collapsing in front of the very community they wanted to impress. Pilar muttered something about misunderstanding, while Jordan tugged at his collar, sweating. But the damage was done. I gathered my papers, slipped them back into my binder, and looked directly at Catherine. For the first time, she lowered her gaze, unable to meet mine. The public climax was complete. They had tried to erase me in silence. I had erased their illusion in front of everyone. And now, the world knew the truth. Consequences have a way of arriving quietly, then crashing all at once. The morning after the vintners' meeting, calls began. Distributors who once entertained Robert's ambitious talk now cut him off. "We prefer to deal with Mrs. Barnes directly," they said. A neighboring vineyard canceled a supply arrangement with Pilar and Jordan, citing trust issues. Even the local bank issued a polite but firm letter. Without legal ownership, Robert's loan inquiries were void, and further attempts would be flagged as fraud. Their empire of arrogance collapsed faster than I expected. Pilar stopped hosting dinners. Jordan, once puffed up with certainty, avoided town altogether. The couple who once walked through my vineyard with the air of royalty now skulked in shadows, their names whispered not with admiration, but with pity. Robert lashed out first. He called me late at night, his voice trembling with rage. "You think you've won? You embarrassed us in front of everyone." "No, Robert," I replied, steady as stone. "You embarrassed yourself. I just provided the mirror." Catherine's silence hurt more than his fury. Days passed without a word, until at last she sent a single text. "I can't believe you'd humiliate your own daughter." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed back, "A daughter who plots against her mother has already chosen humiliation." I just let others see it. I never received a reply. By November, they were gone. Robert and Catherine packed up their belongings, left the house in disarray, and moved into a cramped rental across town. Pilar and Jordan retreated out of state, whispers trailing them like smoke. The vineyard, meanwhile, thrived. Freed from their meddling, the land seemed to breathe again. Workers returned. Distributors renewed contracts, and the trust I had built for decades solidified in the community's eyes. My name, once threatened, was stronger than ever. But the cost was undeniable. Catherine no longer visited, no longer called. The girl I had once cradled was now a stranger by choice. Betrayal, once exposed, cannot be unseen. I often sat on the porch at sunset, looking over the rows of vines glowing in gold light. Frederick's voice still echoed in memory. "Promise me you'll never let them take this place from you." I kept that promise, but in doing so, I lost my daughter. And that was the consequence neither law nor victory could soften. Winter came early that year. The vineyard slept beneath a blanket of fog, the vines stripped bare, the land resting after its battle. I sat on the porch one evening, a cup of coffee warming my hands, when I heard tires crunching on the gravel road. A car stopped at the gate. I couldn't see the driver through the mist, but I knew the shape, the hesitation, the way the headlights dimmed. Catherine. For a long moment, she didn't move. She just sat there, engine idling, as if caught between leaving and coming home. Then, slowly, the car reversed, taillights fading back into the fog. She hadn't come to reclaim anything. She hadn't come to apologize. Not yet. But she had come, and that was enough to remind me. Stories don't end when you win. They wait. They linger. They hold their breath until the next choice is made. I looked out across the vineyard, mine still, mine always, and whispered to the night. "The door isn't locked, Catherine, but it won't open for betrayal again." The vines slept, but spring always comes, and with it, a new chapter. If you want to hear how Emma's story unfolds, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from.